Lieutenant Laura Cobb pressed her back against the concrete wall of Malenta Tunnel as another Japanese artillery shell exploded somewhere above, sending dust and debris cascading through the underground hospital. Around her, 76 other American nurses moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, checking IV lines, changing bandages, comforting wounded soldiers who screamed or wept, or simply stared at the ceiling with eyes that had seen too much. They had been at war for 5 months since Pearl Harbor, 5 months since the Japanese invasion of the Philippines had trapped thousands of American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula, 5 months of constant bombardment, dwindling medical supplies, starvation rations, and an endless stream of wounded men who needed care that the nurses could barely provide with what little they had left. What Cobb didn't know yet, what none of the nurses huddled in that tunnel could possibly have anticipated, was that within hours Corregidor would surrender. Within days, they would become the only group of American military women captured by the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. Within weeks, they would begin 3 years and 2 months of captivity that would test every limit of human endurance, resilience, and the determination to survive against impossible odds. This is not a story about victims. This is a story about 77 American military nurses who refused to break, who maintained their dignity and professionalism under conditions designed to destroy both, who saved lives even while imprisoned, and who emerged from hell itself with their humanity intact. They would become known as the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, but they were not angels. They were women who made the choice every single day for more than 3 years to survive, to endure, to resist in the only ways available to them, to remain nurses even when their captors tried to reduce them to numbers. This is the story of how American military nurses survived the Bataan Death March, endured 3 years and 2 months as Japanese prisoners of war, and lived to tell the world what happened when war consumed everything except the stubborn human refusal to surrender. Before the fall, paradise becoming hell. In December 1941, the Philippines was supposed to be paradise. American military nurses stationed at hospitals in Manila lived in comfortable quarters, attended social functions, dated officers, and enjoyed a tropical posting that many considered the best assignment in the Army or Navy Nurse Corps. The work was demanding but manageable. The climate was warm. The local culture was friendly. War seemed distant, something happening in Europe, not something that would reach this far corner of the American empire. Then came December 8, 1941. Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers appeared over Manila. The illusion of safety shattered in an instant. Within days, Japanese forces invaded the Philippines in overwhelming numbers, pushing American and Filipino defenders back across Luzon toward the Bataan Peninsula. The nurses, Army nurses from Sternberg Hospital and Navy nurses from Canacao Naval Hospital, were ordered to evacuate Manila and establish field hospitals closer to the fighting. They packed what they could carry, left behind everything else, and moved into the jungle and caves of Bataan alongside the combat forces. Lieutenant Laura Cobb, a Navy nurse from Alabama who had joined the Nurse Corps seeking adventure and the chance to serve her country, found herself working 16-hour shifts in makeshift hospitals with supplies that dwindled daily. We went from a fully equipped naval hospital to working in jungle clearings with whatever we could scrounge, she would later recall. No electricity, no running water. Supplies running so low we were reusing bandages after boiling them. And the wounded just kept coming. The Battle of Bataan was a desperate holding action. American and Filipino forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur initially, and then General Jonathan Wainwright after MacArthur evacuated to Australia in March, fought to delay the Japanese advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the United States, but reinforcements never came. The Philippines had been written off, sacrificed to buy time for American forces to regroup elsewhere in the Pacific. By April 1942, the situation was catastrophic. Soldiers were on quarter rations, about 1,000 calories per day for men doing hard physical labor and combat. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery swept through the ranks. Medical supplies were almost completely exhausted. Ammunition was running low. The Japanese, meanwhile, had reinforced and were preparing a final offensive to crush the American Filipino force. The nurses worked under impossible conditions. Lieutenant Cobb remembered treating soldiers with nothing but aspirin for severe wounds because morphine had run out weeks earlier. Men would beg us for something for the pain, she said, and all we could do was hold their hands and lie to them that help was coming. We knew help wasn't coming. They knew it too. But we all maintained the fiction because what else was there? On April 9th, 1942, Bataan fell. More than 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered, the largest surrender in American military history. The nurses, along with remaining wounded soldiers who could be moved, had already been evacuated to Corregidor Island, a fortress at the mouth of Manila Bay that was supposed to be impregnable. Corregidor became the last American holdout in the Philippines. The island was honeycombed with tunnels, Malinta Tunnel being the largest, that provided some protection from the constant Japanese bombardment. The nurses established a hospital deep in the tunnel, treating wounded men by lamplight in conditions that made the jungle hospitals seem luxurious by comparison. For nearly a month, Corregidor held, but the Japanese bombardment was relentless. Artillery and aerial bombing around the clock, systematically destroying everything on the surface. Supplies that were already critically low became non-existent. Food rations were reduced to near starvation levels. The smell in the tunnels became unbearable. Unwashed bodies, infected wounds, overflowing latrines, and the acrid smoke from explosions that sometimes penetrated even underground. The nurses continued working. They had no choice. Wounded men needed care, and there was no one else to provide it. They worked shifts that blurred together into endless cycles of exhaustion, checking vital signs, changing dressings with bandages that had been used and reused until they were falling apart, trying to keep infected wounds clean with water that was increasingly contaminated, and offering comfort to men who were dying from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical facilities. Lieutenant Cobb developed a routine to maintain sanity. I would focus only on the patient in front of me, not the one I just lost, not the one waiting behind him, just the man I was treating right now. If I let myself think about the bigger picture, about how many were dying, about how little we could do, about what might happen when the island fell, I would have fallen apart. So I just focused on one patient at a time. By early May, everyone on Corregidor knew the end was coming. Japanese forces had landed on the island and were fighting through the tunnels. Ammunition was exhausted. Further resistance was pointless and would only result in massacre. On May 6, 1942, General Wainwright made the decision to surrender Corregidor and all remaining American forces in the Philippines. The nurses gathered in Malinta Tunnel, listening to the announcement with a mixture of relief that the bombardment would stop and terror about what came next. We knew about the Bataan Death March, Lieutenant Cobb said. We had heard rumors from Filipino civilians about what happened to the soldiers who surrendered. The forced march, the beatings, the executions, the men left to die by the roadside. We didn't know what would happen to us as women, as nurses, as prisoners. Some of the girls were terrified we would be executed immediately. Others thought maybe being women would protect us. None of us really knew, but we all understood that our lives had just changed in ways we couldn't predict. What happened next would test every one of them in ways that no training, no preparation, no previous life experience could have equipped them to handle. Captivity begins when angels become prisoners. The Japanese forces that took control of Corregidor on May 6th seemed uncertain what to do with 77 American military nurses. Female prisoners of war were rare in any theater of World War II, but in the Pacific they were unprecedented. Japanese military doctrine didn't account for captured enemy women who were military personnel rather than civilians. For the first few days, the nurses remained in Malinta Tunnel under guard while Japanese officers decided their fate. Conditions deteriorated immediately. The Japanese provided minimal food, small portions of rice, sometimes with bits of vegetable, occasionally fish so spoiled it made people sick. Water was restricted. The latrines, already overwhelmed during the siege, became even worse. But worse than the physical discomfort was the psychological terror of not knowing what would happen. Japanese soldiers would enter the tunnel, stare at the nurses, sometimes make crude gestures or comments in Japanese that the nurses couldn't understand but could interpret from tone and body language. The nurses stayed together in tight groups, never allowing anyone to be isolated, always maintaining watch over each other. Lieutenant Maud Davison, the chief nurse who was the senior officer among the group, established rules immediately. We stay together. We maintain military discipline and bearing. We are United States military nurses, and we will conduct ourselves accordingly regardless of circumstances. If we lose that, we lose everything. On May 24th, the Japanese moved the nurses to Manila, to the campus of Santo Tomas University, which had been converted into a civilian internment camp. The nurses were the only military prisoners initially held there, housed separately from the civilian internees, American and Allied civilians who had been living in the Philippines when war broke out. Santo Tomas was overcrowded, with roughly 4,000 internees crammed into facilities designed for a fraction of that number. The nurses were assigned to a small building, the nurses' quarters, that provided some privacy but was still desperately cramped. 11 women to a room designed for 3 or 4. The Japanese camp administrators seemed to view the nurses as a problem to be managed rather than enemies to be punished, at least initially. The nurses were assigned to work in the camp hospital, treating internees who fell ill from malnutrition, tropical diseases, and the general conditions of captivity. In a strange way, having work to do probably saved us, Lieutenant Cobb later reflected. We were nurses. That's who we were, what we did. Even as prisoners, we could still practice our profession, still help people, still have a purpose. That gave us something to hold on to when everything else had been stripped away. But captivity revealed itself gradually in layers of privation and humiliation that accumulated over weeks and months. Food rations were insufficient, around 1,200 calories per day, for women doing physical labor and nursing work. Weight loss began immediately. Within months, every nurse had lost 20 to 30 pounds. Within a year, some had lost 50 pounds or more. Personal belongings were confiscated. The nurses had evacuated Corregidor with only what they could carry, and now even that was taken. Jewelry, watches, cameras, personal letters, photographs. The Japanese kept detailed inventories, promising to return items after the war, but the message was clear. You own nothing now, not even memories captured in photographs. The psychological tactics were subtle but constant. Roll calls at unpredictable times, sometimes in the middle of the night. Inspections where Japanese guards would search the nurses' quarters, ostensibly for contraband, but clearly designed to reinforce their powerlessness. Arbitrary rules that changed without notice. Curfews extended, areas of the camp suddenly declared off limits. Privileges like receiving mail or packages suspended without explanation. They wanted us to understand that we had no control over anything, Lieutenant Cobb said. Our schedules, our food, our space, our possessions, even our dignity. It all existed at their pleasure and could be taken away at any moment. That constant uncertainty, that inability to plan or predict, was almost worse than any specific hardship. The nurses developed coping mechanisms. They established routines within the limited control they had, cleaning their quarters at the same time each day, organizing shifts for nursing work, scheduling time for exercise and what passed for recreation. They celebrated birthdays with whatever could be scrounged. A small piece of fruit saved from rations, a song sung by the group. They held informal classes, teaching each other skills or sharing knowledge about topics they knew well. Most importantly, they maintained military discipline and structure. Lieutenant Davison remained in command, and the nurses followed the chain of command as if they were still on active duty at a military hospital rather than imprisoned thousands of miles from home. Morning report was conducted daily. Uniforms, increasingly patched and worn, were kept as clean and pressed as conditions allowed. Salutes were exchanged. Proper military courtesy was observed. The Japanese tried to make us feel like we were nothing, one nurse recalled, but we knew who we were. We were United States military nurses. That identity, that professional pride was something they couldn't take away unless we surrendered it, and we refused to surrender it. But Santo Tomas, difficult as it was, would prove to be the easiest part of their captivity. In July 1943, the Japanese decided to move the military nurses to a different facility, one designed specifically for prisoners of war rather than civilian internees. The destination was Los Baños Internment Camp, about 40 miles south of Manila, and conditions there would be far worse than anything they had experienced yet. Los Baños, when survival becomes everything. Los Baños internment camp sat in a rural area surrounded by mountains and jungle, isolated from Manila and any possibility of contact with the outside world. The camp had been constructed specifically to house internees, and it was designed with control and deprivation in mind. The nurses arrived at Los Baños in July 1943 to find conditions that made Santo Tomas seem comfortable by comparison. The barracks were crude wooden structures with bamboo walls and thatched roofs that leaked during the frequent tropical rains. Each building was divided into small cubicles, about 8 feet by 10 feet, that housed 2 nurses. There were no beds, just wooden platforms that served as sleeping surfaces, no mattresses, no sheets. Whatever blankets or bedding they had brought with them from Santo Tomas had to suffice. The food situation deteriorated dramatically. Rations at Los Baños were even more inadequate than at Santo Tomas, perhaps 900 calories per day, mostly rice with occasional vegetables and almost never any protein. The rice itself was of poor quality, broken grains, chaff, sometimes infested with weevils or other insects. The nurses learned to pick out the insects before cooking the rice, or simply to ignore them and eat everything because protein was protein, regardless of source. Weight loss accelerated. Nurses who had already lost 30 or 40 pounds at Santo Tomas lost another 20 or 30 at Los Baños. Women who had been healthy and robust when captured now weighed 90 or 100 pounds. Skeletal figures whose uniforms hung on their frames, whose bones were visible through their skin, whose eyes seemed too large for their shrunken faces. Beriberi became endemic, a disease caused by thiamine deficiency that resulted from the monotonous rice diet lacking in vitamins. Symptoms included severe muscle weakness, nerve pain, swelling in the legs and feet, and in severe cases, heart failure. Several nurses developed beriberi so severe they could barely walk. They treated each other with what little they could improvise, but without proper nutrition, the disease was progressive and potentially fatal. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery swept through the camp in waves. The nurses, even while sick themselves, continued to treat other internees in the camp hospital. They worked with almost no medical supplies, no quinine for malaria, no sulfa drugs for infections, no pain medication beyond aspirin that was in desperately short supply. They improvised with traditional remedies with whatever they could scrounge from the surrounding jungle, with sheer determination and nursing knowledge that allowed them to keep people alive through crises that should have killed them. We lost our medical knowledge, our training, our professional identity were our anchors, Lieutenant Cobb explained. We couldn't save everyone. God knows we lost people we should have been able to save if we'd had proper medicine and equipment. But we saved some. We eased suffering. We provided comfort and dignity to people who were dying. That work, that purpose, that professional identity was what kept us human when everything else was trying to dehumanize us. The Japanese guards at Los Baños were harsher than at Santo Tomas. Beatings for minor infractions, failing to bow properly, not moving fast enough, speaking English too loudly became routine. The nurses learned to keep their heads down, to avoid eye contact with guards, to move quickly and quietly when Japanese soldiers were nearby. They learned to anticipate moods and behaviors that might precede violence, developing a sixth sense for danger that allowed them to protect each other. Sexual violence was a constant fear, though the nurses' collective vigilance and the presence of male internees nearby provided some protection. The women never went anywhere alone. They developed a buddy system where no one was ever isolated or vulnerable. They watched for each other, intervened when guards showed too much interest in any individual nurse, and created a protective barrier through solidarity that made targeting any one woman more difficult. "We knew what could happen," one nurse said years later, choosing her words carefully. "We were terrified of it, but we also knew that staying together, protecting each other, never leaving anyone isolated was our best defense." The Japanese respected group cohesion in a weird way. They didn't like it, but they seemed to respect that we maintained discipline and structure. Individual women were vulnerable. The group was stronger. As the war progressed and American forces began advancing across the Pacific, conditions at Los Baños deteriorated further. By late 1944 and early 1945, it was clear even to the prisoners that Japan was losing the war. American bombers appeared overhead with increasing frequency. Radio broadcasts smuggled into camp brought news of American victories. Hope began to grow that liberation might be possible. But hope was dangerous. The guards became more nervous, more unpredictable, more violent as Japanese defeat became inevitable. There were rumors, never confirmed but widely believed, that the Japanese had orders to execute all prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. The nurses made quiet plans among themselves about what they would do if massacre seemed imminent. Some talked about trying to escape into the jungle. Others talked about fighting back even though they had no weapons. Most simply resolved to face whatever came with dignity. By early 1945, starvation was killing people in Los Baños. The daily ration had been reduced to about 700 calories, not enough to sustain life for people doing physical labor or fighting disease. The nurses, themselves starving, continued to work in the camp hospital, but they had almost nothing to work with. People died from diseases that should have been treatable. They died from malnutrition. They died from simple despair, lying down one night and not waking up because their bodies and spirits had nothing left. Lieutenant Cobb lost over 60 pounds from her pre-war weight. At 5 feet 5 inches, she weighed less than 90 pounds by February 1945. I could see every bone in my body, she recalled. My ribs, my hip bones, my spine, everything protruded. I looked like photographs I had seen of concentration camp victims. We all did. We were walking skeletons held together by nothing but stubbornness and the refusal to die. Then, on February 23, 1945, everything changed in a moment none of them had dared to believe would actually come. Liberation, when angels fly. February 23, 1945 began like any other morning at Los Baños. The nurses woke at dawn, conducted morning roll call, divided up the breakfast ration, a small portion of watery rice gruel that barely qualified as food. Lieutenant Cobb was preparing to go to the camp hospital for her shift when she heard sounds in the distance that didn't make sense. Gunfire, close gunfire, then explosions, then something even more improbable. Aircraft flying low, very low, right over the camp. But these weren't Japanese aircraft. The markings were American, and paratroopers were dropping from the sky. We couldn't process what we were seeing at first, Lieutenant Cobb said, paratroopers landing in the fields around the camp. Gunfire everywhere. Japanese guards running in panic, some of the internees screaming, others cheering. It was complete chaos, and we just stood there, frozen, unable to believe this was real. The raid on Los Baños was a brilliantly executed military operation. The U.S. 11th Airborne Division, with Filipino guerrilla assistance, had planned a daring rescue mission to liberate the camp before Japanese forces could execute the prisoners. Paratroopers dropped directly into the camp while ground forces attacked from multiple directions. The operation achieved complete surprise. The Japanese guards were overwhelmed in minutes. The nurses, trained to respond to emergencies, instinctively went to the hospital to help with casualties. But the American soldiers had other priorities. "Get to the Amtraks," they shouted, referring to the amphibious tractors that would evacuate the prisoners across Laguna de Bay. "We're getting you out now. Move." The evacuation was chaotic but efficient. Over 2,100 prisoners, including the 77 nurses, were loaded onto Amtraks and transported across the lake, while American and Filipino forces held off Japanese counterattacks. The entire operation, from first shots to last evacuee leaving the camp, took less than 3 hours. As the Amtrak carrying Lieutenant Cobb and several other nurses sped across Laguna de Bay, the reality began to penetrate. They were free. After 3 years, 1 month, and 17 days of captivity, they were free. Some nurses wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few started laughing, not from humor, but from emotional release, from the sheer impossibility of survival, from disbelief that the nightmare was actually over. "I kept thinking this was a dream," Lieutenant Cobb said, "that I would wake up back in the barracks at Los Baños. It didn't feel real. Even when we reached American lines, even when we saw U.S. soldiers and trucks and supplies, it still felt like something my such a starving brain had conjured up because reality couldn't possibly be this good." The nurses were transported to Manila, now liberated by American forces, and brought to a hospital for medical evaluation and treatment. The doctors who examined them were shocked by their condition: severe malnutrition, advanced beriberi, tropical diseases, infections, dental problems from years of inadequate nutrition, psychological trauma that would take decades to even begin to address. But they were alive. All 77 nurses who had been captured on Corregidor had survived. No other group of American POWs in the Pacific Theater had a survival rate that high. Male prisoners held in other camps had mortality rates of 25 to 40% or higher. The nurses had lost no one, a testament to their collective resilience, their professional skills, their determination to protect and care for each other, and sheer stubborn will. After the war, carrying what can't be left behind, the nurses were evacuated from the Philippines and sent to hospitals in the United States for treatment and recovery. Physical recovery took months. Weight had to be regained slowly to avoid refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition that occurs when malnourished people eat too much too quickly. Diseases had to be treated. Dental work had to be done. Physical therapy was needed for those whose muscles had atrophied from starvation. But physical recovery was the easy part. Psychological recovery would take the rest of their lives. The nurses returned to a country that celebrated them as heroes, the angels of Bataan and Corregidor. But that couldn't really understand what they had endured. Parades and medals and newspaper interviews captured public attention for a few months, then faded. The nurses were expected to return to normal life, to resume nursing careers or get married or simply move on, as though 3 years of captivity and starvation were just an unfortunate interruption. Most struggled. Lieutenant Cobb found herself unable to throw away food, unable to eat a meal without feeling guilty about abundance, unable to sleep through the night without nightmares of guards and roll calls and the constant fear that had become background noise for 3 years. Loud noises made her freeze or flinch. Crowds made her anxious. Being alone felt dangerous, even when she knew rationally that she was safe. "They told us we were fine now," she said years later. "They told us to be grateful we survived, to count our blessings, to move forward. And we tried. God knows we tried. But you don't just move forward from something like that. You carry it with you. Every day, every meal, every moment of safety feels fragile because you learned that safety can vanish in an instant and not return for years." Some nurses struggled with relationships. They had survived by depending utterly on each other, by maintaining bonds of trust and mutual protection that were literally matters of life and death. Returning to a world where relationships were more casual, where people didn't understand that kind of dependency, felt alienating. Several nurses maintained close friendships with their fellow captives for the rest of their lives, the only people who truly understood what they had been through. Others struggled with anger at the Japanese for the brutality of captivity, but also anger at American military leadership that had abandoned the Philippines, anger at a public that celebrated them briefly then forgot, anger at a government that provided minimal support for what we now call PTSD, but in the 1940s was just expected to be something you got over. The nurses received the Bronze Star for their service in the Philippines, and some received other commendations. But medals didn't address the psychological wounds, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the survivor's guilt about comrades who had died while they lived, the complex feelings about maintaining professional identity under conditions designed to strip away humanity. Lieutenant Cobb continued nursing for several years after the war, but eventually left the profession. "I couldn't do it anymore," she explained. "Every patient reminded me of the men I couldn't save on Bataan or Corregidor. Every medical emergency triggered memories of working with nothing. No supplies, no equipment, no hope. I loved nursing, but the war had poisoned it for me. I had to walk away to preserve what was left of myself." Many of the nurses married and had families. They tried to build normal lives. But normal was complicated when you had spent 3 formative years in conditions that were anything but normal. Some never spoke about their experiences, even to their own children. Others spoke obsessively, needing to tell the story over and over as though repetition could somehow make sense of the senseless. The legacy: what survival teaches. The story of the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, the 77 U.S. military nurses who survived captivity in the Pacific, reveals truths about survival, resilience, and the human capacity to endure that go far beyond the specific historical moment. First, it reveals the power of professional identity. The nurses survived in part because they never stopped being nurses, even when they had almost nothing to work with, even when they were starving themselves, even when their captors tried to reduce them to numbers. They maintained their professional identity and purpose. They treated patients. They eased suffering. They saved lives when possible and provided dignity when saving lives wasn't possible. That sense of purpose, that professional identity that existed independent of circumstances, gave them something the Japanese couldn't take away. Second, it reveals the absolute necessity of solidarity. The nurses survived because they refused to let isolation break them. They stayed together, protected each other, never allowed anyone to be vulnerable and alone, shared whatever resources they had, and created a collective resilience that was stronger than any individual could have achieved. The buddy system, the chain of command, the mutual support, these weren't just nice ideas. They were survival strategies that worked because everyone committed to them without exception. Third, it reveals that survival often comes down to the smallest choices made every single day. The choice to get up when you want to lie down and die. The choice to eat food that disgusts you because you need calories to survive. The choice to maintain dignity when everything is designed to strip it away. The choice to help someone else even when you can barely help yourself. These tiny choices, repeated thousands of times over years, were what determined who survived and who didn't. The nurses made those choices. Every day for 3 years, 1 month, and 17 days, they made the choice to survive, to endure, to maintain humanity in conditions designed to destroy it. Fourth, their story reveals the long shadow that trauma casts. Liberation didn't mean the end of suffering. For most of the nurses, the psychological wounds of captivity lasted the rest of their lives. Some found ways to manage those wounds, to build meaningful lives despite them. Others were haunted until death by memories they couldn't escape and pain they couldn't articulate. The legacy of the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor is not just that they survived, though survival itself was a remarkable achievement. The legacy is what they demonstrated about the human capacity to resist dehumanization, to maintain identity and dignity when everything is taken away, to protect each other when no one else will, and to emerge from hell itself still recognizably human. Lieutenant Laura Cobb, in one of her final interviews before her death, was asked what she wanted people to remember about the nurses. Her answer was simple. Remember that we were professionals who did our jobs under impossible conditions. Remember that we were women who protected each other when no one else could. Remember that we survived not because we were angels. We weren't angels, we were just nurses, but because we refused to stop being who we were. The Japanese could take everything from us, our freedom, our possessions, our health, nearly our lives, but they couldn't take away who we chose to be. That was ours, always. The 77 U.S. military nurses who survived Japanese captivity in the Philippines were not angels. They were women who faced impossible odds and chose survival, who maintained professional identity when everything else was stripped away, who protected each other through solidarity that made them stronger than any individual could have been alone, and who carried the wounds of that experience for the rest of their lives. Their story is not about glory or triumph. It's about endurance, about making the choice to survive one more day, then another, until somehow, impossibly, there are enough days accumulated that you've made it through and you're still standing, still yourself, still human, despite everything designed to destroy your humanity. That is the legacy of the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, a legacy not of angelic perfection, but of very human courage, resilience, solidarity, and the stubborn refusal to surrender who you are even when everything else has been taken away.